Hello, fellow adventurers, and welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. In this safari, we're going to be continuing what we were talking about in the last safari, which was the final countdown, part one. If you haven't seen that, you may want to go back and take a look at that because we will be using some of the principles and ideas that we talked about and developed in that safari. In that safari, we looked at the numbers 10, 9, 8, 7, and 6, and talked about where they come from and their etymologies and their connections with number words in some other languages that you may know. So we are going to start where we left off in the last safari with the number 5. So we're just going to complete the countdown here in this episode. So the number 5, where does it come from? If we trace it back to Proto-Germanic, which is that language that was the common ancestor of all the Germanic languages, we believe that the word for 5 was fünfe in Proto-Germanic. Now, in the history of English, between Proto-Germanic and English, that M dropped out. Obviously, we don't have an M or any kind of nasal sound there in that place in the word. We just simplified it and got rid of it. Most Germanic languages did, but if you know the word for 5 in German today, it still has a nasal sound there, very similar, and so it's actually a little bit more conservative than we are. When they say 5 in German, they will actually still have that sound there. Other than that, you can see it's pretty similar as far as the word that is being used. Now, if you think back to Grimm's Law that we were talking about in the last episode, you may be able to figure out or guess in your head what this word might have looked like in Proto-Indo-European. If you undo Grimm's Law, remember what we talked about with where F's come from in Proto-Germanic. F's come from P's. They come from the sound P in Proto-Indo-European. So we would guess, just looking at this Proto-Germanic data, that the word for 5 in Proto-Indo-European might have been something like pimpe, pempe. That's a pretty good guess. Well, let's check our guess and look at some of the other data that we have from some of the other Indo-European languages and their words for 5. What do those words look like? Well, let's look at Latin. This doesn't look anything like pimpe, pempe, or whatever we would have guessed. In fact, it looks quite different. It's quinque. Quinque has two totally different sounds, qua instead of the f's, although the rest of it actually looks the same. It's two syllables. It's got a nasal sound, and instead of m here, it's got an e at the end. So other than those two pretty big things that are different, the word looks pretty similar to what we would have guessed. But still, something is going on here because that is not what Grimm's Law would have predicted. Now, it could be something on the Latin side, so we have to take that into account too. Of course, Spanish and French both get their words for 5 from quinque, which is why they don't look anything like 5, because the Latin word for 5 didn't look anything like 5 either. Now, we're going to need to get some other data to make this make sense. So let's look at Greek. Let's look at the Greek word for 5. The Greek word for 5 was pente. Of course, we get words like pentagon from pente, so you may be familiar with this. So pente is interesting because it does have a P there at the beginning. We thought from the word fünfe in Proto-Germanic that maybe there was a P there at the beginning. Well, look at that. Greek does have a P there, but it doesn't have a P as the consonant after the nasal. It does have a nasal there. The whole shape of the word looks pretty similar. Again, except for those two stubborn consonants that we are trying to explain here. So what's going on with this? Well, I will give you one freebie here, and that is that we know that T's in Greek, especially the Attic Greek dialect that we usually cite, a lot of the T's come from a qua sound in Proto-Indo-European. So when you see a word like pente, it might have originally been penque and not pente. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that is exactly what happened. So pente in Greek is some interesting data that if you study the different languages and their sound laws, it helps you sort of understand a little bit what's going on here. Because we actually reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European word for 5 as penque. Now, this doesn't look quite like pimpe, but it's got a P at the beginning, and it doesn't look quite like quinque, but it does have a que at the end. So how can we explain all of this data? Because none of it seems to point directly to penque, but penque is what we're pretty sure it was the word that was spoken in Proto-Indo-European for 5 several thousand years ago. So how do we explain this? What happened? Well, first of all, there was assimilation. Assimilation is really what we need to talk about. Now, we've talked about assimilation in some previous safaris, but we've really only talked about it with two consonants that are next to each other. But there's another kind of assimilation that's called distant assimilation. Distant assimilation is just when two sounds become more like each other, but they're not next to each other. They're distant from each other in the word. And so what's going on here in the word for 5 is distant assimilation. If the word for 5 in Proto-Indo-European was originally penque, we think that what happened is in the ancestor of Germanic, the qua assimilated to the pa at the beginning of the word. So penque became pimpe, essentially. And then pimpe underwent Grimm's Law to fimfe, and there you go, you get your Fs, because they did come from P's, just like Grimm's Law would have predicted, but there's an extra step here that there was some assimilation that we have to take into account. The interesting thing is that the ancestor of Latin also underwent assimilation, but it underwent the opposite assimilation. So rather than the qua becoming another p, the pa became another qua. So penque became quinque, and that's where you get quinque in Latin and its descendants, which don't have any p's or f's in them at all. So there's some interesting principles of linguistics going on here, and it's kind of helped to circle back around to assimilation. Let's move on to the number 4. The number 4 comes from the Proto-Germanic fethwar. We think that that's about how it would have been pronounced. As you can see, this was a 2-syllable word in Proto-Germanic, and much like the word for 10, which was also a 2-syllable word in Proto-Germanic, it has been sort of run down to 1 syllable in modern English. Fethwar became 4. It sort of just became run together with the th sound totally missing and the w kind of reduced to a helping vowel there with the u. But either way, it's still the same word that we have in modern English from this Proto-Germanic word. Now, you can ask yourself what you think this might have been because of Grimm's Law. Now that you know how to use Grimm's Law, what this might have been in Proto-Indo-European. What does the F come from? A P. What does the TH come from? A T. So we would guess something like petwar or petwar in Proto-Indo-European. Now let's check our work with some of the other words for 4. Once again, we have a problem. When we look at Latin, it's quatwar and not petwar. Now, we did get the twa part right. Clearly, the twa is something going on there in the middle of the word, but the first consonant is not what we would expect. It's actually the same thing that happened with the word for 5. We're expecting a P, and we don't get a P, and Latin tells us it's a qua. So what's going on? Of course, Spanish gets cuatro, and French gets quatre from this word quatuor, and that's why they don't look anything like the word for 4. What about Greek? Greek is going to help us once again here. The more data we can get, the better to try to figure out a particular problem, just like any branch of science. In Greek, or at least Attic Greek, the word for 4 was tetores. And there are a few things you need to know. One of them is what I told you on the last slide, which is that a lot of T's, not all the T's, but a lot of T's in Greek actually come from a Indo-European qua sound. So that T at the beginning of tetores actually probably comes from que. So this actually tells us that it agrees with Latin quatuor. So Latin is telling us it's quatuor. Greek is telling us it's quetores, and we think the 2 T's are from twa. So we actually reconstruct quetores as the word for 4 in Proto-Indo-European. Now, that begs the question, what's going on here in Germanic? Because Germanic is now the odd one out. It's not like last time when we were talking about 5, where both Germanic and Latin did some assimilation. What's going on with Germanic? How did Germanic get from a qua to a F, because that's not what Grimm's Law says should have happened. We think that this is actually a different kind of assimilation. You might think of it as a very distant assimilation. It's assimilating to something that's not even in the same word. Because people count, and they count in a particular order, linguists have noticed that numbers, especially numbers that are next to each other in the counting order, oftentimes have impacts on each other. In other words, people will take a sound that belongs in one number and put it into another number, especially if that number is right next to it in the counting order. So we think that this kind of assimilation is what happened in the history of the Germanic languages. We think that the original qua that was at the beginning of the word for 4 assimilated to the P in the word for 5, which would have been penque or pempe, and then fimfe, and that's where you got what was probably originally a P that underwent Grimm's Law, as you would expect, and the P became an F, and that's why 4 starts with an F in the Germanic languages. The F comes from a P via Grimm's Law, and the P comes from assimilation to the word for 5, because 4 and 5 are right next to each other. Let's keep going to the word for 3. These are actually going to get a little bit more simple as we finish off the countdown here. 3 is from the Proto-Germanic word threes. It was actually 2 syllables originally, and then it got run together. You can see how easily threes could just be run together to 3, dropping the ending. So nothing too complicated there. So Proto-Germanic has threes. If you go back to Grimm's Law, you can probably guess where that TH comes from. In Indo-European, it just comes from a T, and luckily, luckily, when we look at the Latin and Greek data, we don't have any of the problems that we had with the numbers for 5 or 4, because that's exactly what we get. We get a T there. In Latin, it was trace, and of course, the Spanish and French still look very similar to that today. The Greek is also trace, but the Greek has what looks like kind of a diphthong there, and in Greek, that diphthong tells us, not to give too many details, but it tells us that there used to be 2 syllables there, which is exactly what the Proto-Germanic data is telling us. 3 ye's was 2 syllables. So when we put all the data together, we reconstruct treyes as the word for 3 in Proto-Indo-European, because 2 of the 3 languages are telling us there were 2 syllables there, not 1. And actually in Latin, that E is long too, which also accounts for 2 short E's being run together to a long E. So the T became th via Grimm's law. Very simple, nothing too complicated here that we have to worry about. It all makes sense once you know that one simple fact of Grimm's law. T becomes H. Something similar is going on with 2, where it's actually not too complicated, once again, once you understand Grimm's law, but we're going to see a different sound in Grimm's law than t to th, because in Proto-Germanic, the word for 2 was toi. By the way, that W in English was originally pronounced. This would have originally been pronounced tuo, and you can see how that's hard to say tuo with a W and an O next to each other. So the W would have fallen out pretty early in English. Obviously, today the W has long since been silent, and then with the Great Vowel shift, the O became an oo sound, and that's why we say tu and not tuo. But that all happened in the history of English. But it goes back to Proto-Germanic toi, which is very similar to tuo, and which has since become tu. So if you go back to Grimm's law, where should that T have come from? It should have come from a D. So this should be voting for a D. And when we look at Latin, what do we get? A D right there. Not only that, but there's a W sound right after it. They spell it with a U and not a W, but duo, duo, very similar to Proto-Germanic toi. Of course, Spanish and French have both added a plural-looking SN to it that was not originally there, but obviously still the same word. If we look at Greek, it's duo. It's the same word. So all of these words are really coming together quite nicely for us to guess that the Proto-Indo-European word for 2 was something like duo. Now, many people put a laryngeal at the end of this for some reasons that we don't need to go into. So this may have originally been duo or duo, or however the laryngeal was pronounced, and not just duo. But either way, we've successfully figured out the word for 2, more or less, just from this data. There are some other connections in various languages to the word for 2 that it might be worth talking about. One of them is Twain, like the name Mark Twain, which, as you probably know, the famous American author, was not his real name. That was a pen name. That word Twain, which was originally just a word and not a name, comes from Twain. That's how you would have pronounced that in Old English, Twain. The G would have been kind of like a Y sound, which comes from this word for 2. We also get our prefix bi, which would have been pronounced bi in Latin. And the reason is that this was originally dui, which comes from duo, obviously, dui. And there was a sound law in the history of Latin that does became buzz. So our prefix bi, actually comes from the word for 2, because it used to be dwi. I mean, they didn't pronounce it that way, but that's how we would pronounce it. The similar prefix in Greek is just di, or di, which also means 2 of something, and that comes straight from the Greek di, which would have also been a prefix that meant 2, straight from this particular word for 2. So far, we've just been looking at what we call cardinal numbers, which are 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But for the last couple, I would like to look at some ordinal numbers as well. The reason that we haven't been looking at ordinal numbers up until now, such as 3rd, 4th, 5th, is that they're very similar and they share very similar etymologies. But the last 2 ordinal numbers, as we count down, are going to have their own etymologies that are worth looking at. So let's talk about the ordinal number that goes with 2. When you want to say 2, you don't say the tooth, you don't say the 2th, you say the second. Right? That's the word that we use in English to describe when you're counting something 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. Where does this particular word come from that goes with our number 2, but looks very different? So clearly, it has a different etymology. This is actually one of the few numbers that in the English language, certainly, that has been borrowed. This is not a native Germanic inheritance. It comes from the Old French second, and that would have come from Latin secundus, which was not actually a number, because it was an adjective that meant following, or the next one in order, or if something is next after the first, it's the second one in a sequence. So you can see how this word might have evolved from a word that meant following to a word that meant second, because it's the one that follows first. By the way, there's a whole family of sequa words, including sequence, that have something to do with following, and we might have to do another episode on them down the road. You might be wondering, okay, so before we borrowed this ordinal number in the Middle English period from French, what was our word in English for saying second? It was actually another word that we have that we still use today, but in a very different way, or a slightly different way at least, and that is other. Other was the original native English word for second. So you would say first, other, third, fourth, etc. And the reason is that other would just be the other of two, first and then the other one, and then third, fourth, fifth, and whatever else you wanted. So you can see that sometimes number words can basically be borrowed, even though they usually aren't. But there may be a good reason for it. And in this case, the reason was that other was already kind of a vague term. Just like today, other doesn't have to mean the second of two. It could mean other in a number of different ways. So English speakers were happy to take over this word from French that specifically meant number two, the second one that we are talking about. Okay, let's finally get to the number one. Where does the number one come from? It comes from Proto-Germanic einaz. The diphthong was simplified. It became an O in the history of English. We chopped the ending off, but it still looks recognizably the same, as you can see. When we compare einaz to other words for one in Indo-European languages like Latin unus, you can tell that it looks pretty similar. There's no Grimm's law to worry about here because there aren't any stops. Of course, the Spanish and French words for one do come from the Latin word for unus, which is why they have that U there. When we put all that together, when we try to reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European word for one, we think it was something like oinos. Other connections to the word for one, all of our una words come from the Latin word unus. So unify means to make one. Unite means to make one. Unique means there's only one of something. A university, well, that's a whole another story, but it has the word for one in it, and it originally has something to do with a community, a group of people doing all sort of studying and going toward knowledge in one community, essentially, and that's where the oneness comes from. Interestingly, we have another word in English that also comes from this word for one. It comes from the Proto-Germanic einaz, at least, and that is our indefinite article, which can be a or an, depending on whether there is a consonant after it or not. It also maintains the n, at least when there is a vowel following it, because originally a or an just meant one. If you have a word, it's one word, and was just sort of an unstressed variant of that Proto-Germanic word einaz. Okay, let's look at the ordinal number for one, and of course that's first, which doesn't look anything like it. So again, it's going to have a separate etymology, just like we saw with second. But unlike what we saw with second, this is actually going to be a native English word. This is not something we borrowed from anyone else. It comes from the Old English fürst, and fürst was just originally a superlative adjective. In other words, the most of something. It had that est ending that we still have today in English that means the strongest, the fastest. This was the forest. That's actually the etymology of first. It's the forest. It's the most forward. And originally it didn't necessarily mean first in the number sense. It just meant foremost or going before all others. And you can see how that would come to mean first. If you're first, you're ahead of everybody else, right? Where does this F come from? Well, once again, you can undo Grimm's law, and this is probably something you have gotten used to by now. What do F's come from? They come from P's, right? So this comes from something it must have been a word in Indo-European, and sure enough, it does come from a word in Indo-European, and it's cognate with other words for first in other languages, such as Latin primus. We obviously get a lot of words from this Latin word primus, like prime and primary. They all have something to do with one or being first, essentially, because this was the Latin word for one. Finally, I'm going to give you a bonus word here, because Indo-European had not one, but two words for one. But these were not identical words for one. They were not interchangeable. They actually had different meanings. The word for one that we saw 2 slides ago, the oinos word, was the normal word for counting one. If you're going to count 1, 2, 3, you would use oinos. But there was another word that had a slightly different meaning that still meant one, but it actually meant one and the same. If you were going to say this thing is the same, this is one and the same as something else, you would use this other word in Indo-European. And this word in Indo-European was the root sem. We see the root sem all over the place in a number of different languages. So let's briefly go through some of the places we see the word sem. You might have already guessed just by looking at this that one of the places we see this in English is the word same. The word same comes straight from this root in Indo-European. As you can see, we don't have any Grimm's law sounds to worry about, so nothing really changes much except a little bit of the vowels here. So same comes from this word that meant one and the same in Indo-European. Interestingly, we get another word that I'm sure you use every day in English from the root sem, and that is some. Now, some doesn't necessarily mean one anymore, but originally in its old English usage, some meant something like a certain one. So you would say some of something, and that meant one of something. So we've evolved the meaning a little bit, but you can still see it in compounds like something, which just means one thing, a certain thing. That's what you mean when you say something. So you can still see that idea of one lurking behind compounds like something. Okay, so those are some very, very common words in English. I mean, we use same and some probably every day. These are very common words that come from the root sem. Let's go to Greek. You might notice that a couple slides ago when we were looking at the word for one, I gave you the Proto-Germanic and I gave you the Latin, but I didn't give you the Greek. And there's a particular reason I didn't give you the Greek, and that is that Greek actually chose for their normal word for one not to use the regular word for one in Indo-European at all, and they just used this root. So Greek got its regular word for one from this root sem, and it's actually hen. Which again doesn't look anything like sem, but if you know the sound laws, it makes a lot of sense because as we've seen, S became H at the beginning of a word, and then M becomes N at the end of words, which is a pretty minor difference. So sem became hen, and that was the regular word for one in Greek. Now you could decline it, which you don't need to worry about if you don't know a language with declensions, but there were other ways this could look as well, but hen was the basic way that the word for one could look. But there were other words in Greek that also have the root sem in them. They're also going to start with H because all of the S's turn to H's at the beginning of words in Greek. But they're going to be words that you know. They're going to be words that you know from English because we have gotten things from them in English. One of them is homos. Homos was an adjective in Greek that meant same. And again, the S became an H. So homos is really somos, which looks a lot like same. And interestingly, they are the same word from Indo-European. That's all homos meant was same. And so you can understand why a word that means same comes from this word that meant one and the same, just like our English word same. However, you might not see coming the next one that I'm going to put up because today we consider it the opposite of homos, and that is heteros. Heteros actually also comes from this root sem. Now, heteros means different, and today we consider these opposites. Homo, anything means same. Hetero, anything means different. So why would these both come from a word and a root in Indo-European that means one? Well, first of all, heteros comes from hen, teros. So hen is one. Teros is a suffix in Indo-European that could be a comparative suffix. So like from the perspective of the first thing, it's something else. That's sort of what a comparative suffix might do. So heteros means from the perspective of one, it's something else. So you can see why that could come to mean a word that means other, because originally it just meant one or the other of two different things. That's how you would use this word heteros in Greek. So if you were going to say something in English like one thing is like this, but the other thing is like that, in Greek you would say the heteros thing is like this and the heteros thing is like that. You would use them for one and the other in English, if that makes sense. So heteros was an interesting word in Greek that basically means other, but it's a little deeper than that, and that helps us to understand how heteros comes from henteros, which ultimately comes from the root sem. So interesting stuff there. Finally, let's talk about some Latin cognates of sem, because there are a lot of Latin cognates of sem as well. You might have already guessed the word similar comes from this root sem. It comes from the Latin word similis, which means like or similar. It's not too complicated. We get other words like simulate from the sim in Latin that comes from the Indo-European word sem. This comes from a verb, simulo, and the past participle was simulatum, which is where we get the T from at the end of simulate. Simulo just meant to make something like something else, right? It means to simulate something is one way you could say it. So we do get simulate from this word, from this root in Indo-European that means one and the same, and you can see why. What about some other Latin cognates? Simple actually comes from this. The sim part is from sem. The last part, plex, comes from an Indo-European root that means to fold. So simplex literally means one fold, which means it's not Here's a word that also comes from the plex root, complex at all. Simplex and complex are actually antonyms. They're opposites because simplex is one fold, complex is folded together. In other words, it's more complicated, which of course also comes from complex. Another word we get from from a Latin word that derives from the sem root is single, just comes from Latin singulus, which means solitary or by themselves or whatever. So you can see why single would have something to do with this. It would also come from this other Indo-European word that means one. Finally, let's look at a trio of compounds that all come through French in some way. So they've changed it up a little bit, as French often does. It might look a little different, but it still comes from some Latin compounds. The first word is assemble. We've seen in a previous safari that when a word starts with a plus two identical consonants in English, it probably comes from odd plus a Latin word, and that's exactly what's going on with the word assemble. Assemble comes from odd simulo, which means to make alike or make into one. That's the original meaning of this compound in Latin. Now, French ran it together, dropped the U, and then a B sprouted up between the M and the L. It's what we call an excrescent consonant. It's the same as a number, by the way, from numerus. The same thing happened there. And so assemble originally meant to put together like you're assembling furniture. But ultimately, the semantics evolved to the point where you could also assemble people into an assembly, which doesn't necessarily mean making them all the same person or cloning them or something, but it means putting them all into one place. That's essentially what an assembly is when we're talking about people. How about resemble? Resemble comes from the Latin prefix re, plus simulo, which has the same idea of being like. If you resemble somebody, you are like them. You look like them, and that's essentially what that word means. But again, it comes through French, and that's why that B is in there, and the spelling and sound is a little bit different. Finally, how about an ensemble? This obviously looks and sounds very French, so you're probably not surprised to hear that this comes through French, but it ultimately comes from Latin in simul. Simul was a adverb that meant at the same time in Latin, meaning at one time. That's the one idea there. So if something is done ensemble, it's done at the same time. We use this today a lot of concerts. If something is done ensemble, it's a concert, which also comes from some Latin words that mean to do something together or at the same time. So we get all of this stuff from this other Indo-European word that meant one. Just a bonus word there as we finish our countdown. That completes our countdown. It took 2 whole episodes to get through because there was a lot of stuff to talk about and a lot of stuff to go through. I hope you found it really interesting. I think historical linguistics is really cool because we can learn so much about the past by just learning some basic principles, and I hope that I've been able to explain them to you here in these 2 episodes. Comment below if you have any other connections you want to make, because there really are a lot of connections. See you next time.